Most Muslims grow up with a very clear picture. Islam began in Mecca. Mecca was an ancient city, a center of trade, a sanctuary known across Arabia. This is rarely questioned. It is simply inherited, almost like qadr, destiny. But when historians, including Muslim historians, start reconstructing late antique Arabia using geography, inscriptions, archaeology, and contemporaneous writings, a quiet question emerges. Does the historical evidence match the traditional picture of pre-Islamic Mecca? We are not here to mock belief. We are here to separate three things: what the sources say, what the evidence shows, and what we can responsibly infer. Traditionally, Muslim sources describe Mecca as a well-established city long before Islam. The Kaaba is treated as an ancient sanctuary connected to Ibrahim and Ismail. The Qur'an itself states that Ibrahim and Ismail raised the foundations of the house in Surat al-Baqarah, the cow. Classical tafsir, such as Ibn Kathir, understands this as the Kaaba being rebuilt upon earlier foundations. More broadly, Islamic tradition commonly holds that the Kaaba existed long before Islam, not decades earlier, but many centuries earlier. The Qur'an refers to the Kaaba as al-Bayt al-Haram, the sacred house, and in Surat al-Imran, family of Imran, it says, "The first house established for mankind was at Bakka." This is the context in which Bakka appears as the name of the valley or place associated with the sanctuary. That matters historically, because if this name refers to a known location, we would expect it to appear outside later Islamic memory. Early Islamic historians describe Quraysh as merchants engaged in seasonal travel, moving north and south. Surat Quraysh, the Quraysh, is often read as reflecting this pattern. In the Sirah literature associated with Ibn Ishaq, later preserved by al-Tabari, Mecca appears as both sacred and economically active. Within the Islamic tradition, this narrative is internally consistent. Now we step outside the tradition. Modern historical criticism of the Meccan trade hub claim is closely associated with Patricia Crone. Her argument is not theological, but logistical. If Mecca was a major international trade center, where is the evidence? Ancient trade routes are relatively well known. Major pre-Islamic caravan and oasis centers such as Taima, Dadan, Al-Ula, Najran, and Qaryat al-Faw appear in inscriptions and archaeology. Mecca does not. Crone also noted that by the 4th to 6th centuries, long-distance trade increasingly relied on Red Sea maritime routes. Ships passed through Bab al-Mandab and sailed directly toward Egyptian and Ethiopian ports. One background factor often discussed by historians is geopolitics. Periods of intensified Byzantine-Sasanian conflict made overland routes less predictable, while maritime corridors were easier for states to secure and control. This does not explain everything, but it helps clarify why inland desert routes, especially those off the main arteries, became economically marginal. One brief but telling example comes from Claudius Ptolemy. In his Geographia, the most detailed ancient map of Arabia we have, Ptolemy names many inland and western Arabian towns. But not Mecca, nor anything clearly identifiable as Bakka. This does not prove non-existence, but it does make it difficult to sustain the claim that Mecca was a major, widely known center in the pre-Islamic world. Muslim scholars respond with an important caution. Absence from Greco-Roman sources does not equal non-existence. Trade does not need to be imperial to be meaningful. Quraysh commerce may have been regional and seasonal, leaving little archaeological trace. That is fair, but it also means the evidence does not support Mecca as a major international hub. At best, we are dealing with a limited local economy that later tradition framed in broader terms. A simple analogy helps. A town can be vital to its region without appearing on global maps. Now to the question of sanctuaries. Pre-Islamic Arabia was rich in religious sites. Inscriptions and archaeology attest sanctuaries and sacred precincts across the peninsula. In Taima, Duma al-Jandal, Najran, Qaryat al-Faw, and elsewhere. These sites are named, excavated, and clearly cultic. Against that background, one fact stands out. No pre-Islamic inscription mentions Mecca. No inscription mentions Bakka, which appears to be important as it is mentioned in the Qur'an. No inscription mentions the Kaaba, the key sanctuary of Islam that allegedly existed long before Islam. This matters precisely because Islamic tradition holds that the Kaaba predates Islam by many centuries, going back to Ibrahim. If that were historically visible beyond sacred memory, we might expect at least indirect confirmation. So far, there is none. Muslim scholars reply that Meccan sanctity may have been local rather than pan-Arabian, and that inscriptional survival is uneven. That is possible, but it weakens the claim that Mecca was already the central sanctuary of Arabia before Islam. A shrine can be ancient and sacred without being widely known. At this point, a natural question arises. Why not excavate and find out? Here we face a modern constraint. Archaeology in Mecca is effectively closed. Saudi authorities have long restricted excavation in the sanctuary area. Part of this is practical. Continuous habitation, massive crowds of locals and international tourists coming for the Hajj and Umrah, the pilgrimage, and constant redevelopment. Part of it is political and religious. Archaeology can produce uncomfortable results, including the possibility of finding nothing, while very much expected. In that sense, excavation carries risk, not only promise. So the material record remains thin, and the traditional narrative remains largely untested. Next, environmental clues. The Qur'an frequently uses imagery of gardens, cultivated land, vineyards, and olives, for example in Surat al-Tin, the fig. Olives, however, belong naturally to the Mediterranean and Levantine climate zones. They do not grow in the arid basin of Mecca. A common response is that the climate in late antiquity may have been different, perhaps wetter, allowing such vegetation deeper in Arabia. While climate did fluctuate, available paleoclimate research does not support the idea that the Hijaz became an olive-growing region in the 6th century. In fact, much of Arabia experienced climatic stress rather than sustained fertility. Muslim interpretation often takes another route. Quranic imagery is universal and symbolic, not a description of local farming. That is a legitimate reading. Still, when a text repeatedly assumes certain landscapes and vegetation as familiar and rhetorically natural, historians ask whether those landscapes were closer to home. Now the monotheist context. The Qur'an argues intensely with Jewish and Christian ideas. It does not merely mention them, it debates them directly. For example, it explicitly rejects the divinity of Jesus. In Surat al-Ma'idah, the table, the Qur'an quotes Jesus denying that he ever told people to worship him or his mother, and condemns those who say, God is the Messiah, son of Mary. In Surat al-Ikhlas, sincerity, the Qur'an insists that God does not beget and is not begotten. These are not passing remarks. They are sustained theological arguments. Such argumentation assumes an audience already familiar with Christian claims about Jesus. Historically, Jewish and Christian communities in Arabia are well attested in Yathrib, Medina, Khaybar, Najran, Taima, and the northern frontier closer to the Levant. Mecca, once again, is not externally attested as such a center. Muslim scholars respond correctly that ideas travel. Oral culture is powerful. Individuals and traders can transmit religious concepts. Put simply, hearing about Christians is one thing. Repeatedly arguing against their core doctrines usually means prolonged exposure via close and frequent contacts, not distant rumor or hearsay. That does not prove the Qur'an did not emerge in Mecca. But it does make an idea of birthplace of Islam being closer to the north of Arabia or even in Palestine more plausible. So where does this leave us? Islamic tradition gives us a confident picture: an ancient sanctuary, a meaningful city, active trade, and a pagan environment receiving revelation. External evidence gives us a thinner and more ambiguous picture. Many sanctuaries are attested elsewhere. Trade hubs are attested elsewhere. Monotheist communities are attested elsewhere. And Mecca remains largely silent in the pre-Islamic record, with archaeology effectively off-limits. None of this disproves Islam. None of it refutes the Qur'an as revelation. But it does suggest that the traditional historical narrative may include retrospective shaping, theology solidifying into geography, and sacred memory becoming concrete history. Before we close, one final note. There is a modern theory associated with Dan Gibson arguing that Petra in Jordan fits early Islamic geography better than Mecca. That claim deserves careful, separate treatment, and we will examine it on its own. So we end with a question. If history points to a more complex origin story than the one we inherited, are we willing to follow the evidence, even if it leads somewhere unexpected? If you like this video, leave your thoughts in the comments. If you want a specific topic explored next, let us know. Subscribe to the channel. Ergo dubito. Think critically.